The Wanderer by Seamus Deireanach. Read by Anthony B. Shannon. A wanderer sits upon a bed with a young woman. The woman who is sitting upon the bed is penetrated, not by his penis, but by his blade. She is but another victim who will never be missed, and that is why she was chosen. No one would miss a low-rent hooker. No one. It's always better to kill those who will be soon forgotten. When these bodies are hidden immediately following death, they really have no danger of ever being found. She was young and sickly-looking, and must have had some type of drug addiction. But none of that matters anymore. She couldn't have been more than 15, 16 at the most. Girls like her always made the best victims, because they usually prove to be the most disposable. This hopeless girl now lies lifeless on a dirty bed in a cheap motel like so many more which came before her. He slips the knife out from in between her legs, and he drops the knife as his hands tremble and shake. To him it is funny that what moments ago were the tools of boundless carnage are now the weak and brittle hands of an average man. When he pulled the knife out of what was once her genitals, her entrails spilled all over the bed, making a mess. This kind of thing rarely happens, as usually being fucked by a knife is not fatal in such a small span of time. Maybe she was too weak, maybe he was too excited. But whatever the case, he had to clean it up. He slipped the corpse into a large garbage bag and carried it into the dirty motel room's tub. He would have to leave it there for a few moments to grab the suitcase with the equipment from his truck. When he returned, she remained just as any dead thing should, lifeless and still. He shut the door quietly behind him and locked himself with the girl whose name he had now forgotten. She really was beautiful, he thought as he reached to touch her breasts. But then the memories returned to him just as they did earlier. He couldn't hold himself back, and he started to cut her apart. He should have cut her apart calmly, orderly. But when the memories came, he let go, and in the process, he made a mess. After cleaning up the mess, he knew what he had to do. He had to leave. He filled his truck full of black bags, paid his bill, and left. He had to escape the memories. He had to leave his father. He had to leave his desires. Every time he tried to do it with a woman, his father returned to his mind. All the memories that made him the man he was were re-entering his mind, and he had to get rid of them now. Needing to make the pain stop, he left that godforsaken town and stopped at the river and dumped that whore's body. It didn't matter if he was found. All that mattered now was if the pain would subside. When the pain wouldn't subside, he continued driving. The first state that passed didn't seem like enough, so he did another, and another. He'd been driving for 2 days straight when he finally felt the need to stop. He decided to rest in another cheap motel, but this time he wouldn't try his hand at a girl. When he stopped in a motel parking lot for a rest, he found it oddly vacant. From the space where he parked, he saw the motel's clerk staring blankly into nothingness. Something was strange and offsetting about the way the clerk stood there. He gazed off in the distance as if absolutely unfazed by the world that surrounded him. The clerk was dirty and unkempt to the point of looking like he had no contact with the outside world. The wanderer then walked in regardless. When the wanderer entered the building, the clerk greeted him with, "Yes, I have been waiting for you." The delivery was so labored it gave the impression that it had been decades since this voice had last been used. The wanderer left, fearing that his capture was imminent. The wanderer did not know why he had stopped there. He felt as if he had somehow been entranced and seduced by an unknown force to make him stop. But his thoughts concerning why he had decided upon there were quickly pushed aside by his fears of being caught. The girl's body had been dumped in such an emotional outpouring. Could he have been discovered? Terrifying thoughts like these echoed through his mind as he circled back into the town, oblivious to the force which controlled him. Upon re-entering the town, he noticed it was vacant. He parked in the hollow parking lot exactly where he parked before. He then looked into the entrance to meet the clerk's gaze. When he entered and asked to rent a room, the clerk was unfazed. When the wanderer retired to his bed, he fell asleep quickly despite fear of discovery. A man walked from the void into a bar and ordered a drink. The bar and drink were something of a much-cherished routine for the man. A beautiful woman who had been waiting for him kisses him in a deep and impassioned way. When they pulled back, he could see her face. It was pale and soft. She had green eyes, blonde hair, moderately full pink lips, and a small feminine nose. She giggled childishly with affection after seeing an introverted look from a loved one. She then grabbed his hand and crossed her fingers between his, and told him, "It's been so long," as tears of excitement rolled down her face. He was led by his girlfriend as they left. Upon leaving, the man noticed that the bar was full of people, yet, strangely, he and his partner were the only ones making any noise. All the bar's patrons were expressionless, along with the bartender. Their faces had a strange, sickly skin color, which covered every orifice, their mouths, their lips, their nostril holes. Despite having no holes to conduct respiration, they breathed heavily, as if they were runners parched with a thirst for air, flaps of skin expanding with the opening and closing of what were mouths. As the couple left, the patrons stared and followed them across the room. Upon walking out of the bar, the man found himself facing the woman on a couch, as if there had been no time for travel. She giggled and hesitated for a moment with an innocent smile before lifting her top in preparation for a sexual encounter. As she did this, she began to change, becoming smaller, pudgier, and much less innocent. When she had finished undressing, her hair was becoming matted and dirty. Her face was covered in filth, as his sister now sat weeping before him. Then an affectionate hand reached out and began to rub his back. His father then whispered, "You're going to be a good boy and not a bad girl like your sister, aren't you?" He awoke crying from the nightmare which would follow him forever. He then looked around the room in order to discover what time it was. Strangely, there was no clock in his room. After getting out of bed to look outside, noticing it was late in the afternoon, he thought how he could have let this happen. He had to leave now. Quickly dressing, he left his room in order to pay the bill to leave. When he went to the front desk, he discovered it was void. He called, but no one responded. After this, he knocked upon door after door, only to find them vacant. The whole building, with him as its exception, was vacant, as was the parking lot. He walked out looking for anyone who could be living in this town. The town was abandoned and utterly without life, as it had long since been left to nature. Building after building was boarded up, and the road itself was cracked and withered by time. It seems as if no one in the rest of the world even knows that this town exists. The wanderer walks, slowly dazed by fear and confusion, towards the center of the town, and in that center lays a cathedral far older than the buildings that surround it. The cathedral's architecture possibly seems to date back hundreds of years prior to the colonization of America. The cathedral itself is maintained in immaculate condition, and especially so when compared to the buildings that surround it. He continues on towards the cathedral despite his best inhibitions and instincts, as if guided by a force which is beyond his control. The congregation had been waiting for him, and they had all been staring since he first entered, and most likely long before as well. The congregation all resembled each other closely in their unkempt fashion. The exception was the beast which stood before the altar. The congregation's priest had the body of a man, but what seemed to be the head of a wolf and a deer crossed. Just as the wanderer realized how strange his situation truly was, the priest spoke to him. "We have all been waiting for you." His instincts demanded that he should run, but before he could, he was restrained by the church members acting in unison. He was then laid and tied down upon the altar. The congregation then returned to their seats as the priest returned to his podium. Then he spoke to the man in a method so that the whole of the mass could hear him speak. "I have seen you in my dreams, and have seen your acts within them. You are wicked, and without any resolve for your victims. You are what we have been looking for ever since I was called out by that which has always been. You mirror the Eternal's hatred and contempt in your inability to feel for others. By sacrificing you and letting your blood hit the earth, we will absorb your essence. With your essence, those who make up this institution's body will be one step closer to sharing with my abilities to see which lies beyond." With that, the priest then pulled a blade from his podium. The blade was unclean and stained with the blood of those who had previously been sacrificed. The priest then inserted the blade into the wanderer's belly, and left it there before sitting down. Throughout all this time the congregation sat silently, and they remained silent along with their leader for the many hours it took for the wanderer to bleed to death. A boy sat across from his sister in a crawl space. They were both tied to chairs and gagged, but it didn't matter anyway, because any sound they could possibly make would never escape. Even if their cries could have been heard, it would not matter, because the only other person who knew how to reach them was the man who placed them there. They had been sitting there for what seemed to have been a millennia, as 2 days tied to a chair without food, water, sound, and light would seem that long to any person in the world. One day in the eternity, the darkness was penetrated by a man carrying a flashlight. Their father entered the room with a gas can, flashlight, and funnel. He put the flashlight down where the boy's shoulder and chair met. The boy knew instinctively how important it was to balance the flashlight to light his sister. The father took the gag out of the girl's mouth, and she immediately began screaming. He then slapped her head until she lay there without the energy needed to fight back any longer. He then picked her head up and opened her mouth, shoving the funnel down her throat to pour the cold soup into her mouth to prevent starvation and dehydration. With all the brutality in play in front of him, all he could do was focus on the rashes that covered his sister's naked body, because he now had an explanation for all his pain and discomfort. Then his father laid the flashlight down on his sister's chair in preparation to feed him. He did not resist as his sister did, and his father rubbed his back as he told him how good a boy he was. He hated his treatment just as much as his sister, but he knew resistance was not worth the cost. The father proceeded to install a light fixture into the room, a hint of mercy after the eternity of darkness. This was followed by an act of compassion, cleaning their excrement and moving them onto chairs with holes and buckets. His sister resisted by still shitting and pissing on the seat. To them it made no sense why they were here. The room was usually used as punishment, only for a few hours whenever they had refused him. But on that day their question was answered. After finishing the light fixture, he returned with a cooler. He dumped the cooler out to reveal their brother's corpse. Their father then told them that this is what happens to a child who tries to leave the love of his parents, and that they had been locked up in order for him to know they were safe. Their true punishment for their brother's transgression was to watch him decompose before their eyes. Their father continued to have his way with them just as before, but now they stayed there between intervals. This continued for another eternity as days became weeks, weeks became months, and finally months became years. One night the boy awoke to see that his sister was not sitting in the adjacent chair, and that he was no longer tied down. He knew his abandonment by instinct and promptly left. The whole house was empty with the exception of him and his brother. He then wandered aimlessly out of that house, and everywhere he went ever since. Now the man that was once the boy awakes in a dark abyss, but he does not fear its cold and desolate nature, for this is all he has ever known. In this dark abyss he senses a faint light in the distance. Upon traversing the distance, he comes to see that the light is coming from a cellar's window. He looks into the window and sees his sister is pregnant and deeply scared. She is surrounded by the corpses of the malformations that had no doubt been her children. She looks and sees into her brother's eyes, and in the process sends shivers into the grisly killer's spine. All the corpses that surrounded her are those of his victims, but also of their children. She gets up and grabs him, and transcends to the glass to share a kiss with him. When she pulls back her body, she sits above him, preparing to make love. But her face is not her own. It is the face of their father. She begins to make love with him, but her face continues to change into that of each and every one of his victims. When they finish, she gets off him and leaves the bed. Only then does he realize they were surrounded by a faceless mob. Their faces then begin to contort and rip holes from mouths, and begin chanting, "You have betrayed me," repeatedly. He then shuts his eyes for a few fleeting moments of peace, thinking he can escape the stream. When he opens them, he is surrounded by his victims, joined by every woman that he has ever been attracted to, as they chant, "You have betrayed me." In one last attempt to hide from his pain, he shuts his eyes, hoping that it was all just a dream. When he opens his eyes again, he sees that he is now surrounded by various versions of his sister, young and old, battered and cherished, each from a different universe. They chant, "You have betrayed me." Blood then pours from their wombs and drowns him, as his soul is devoured by God.